morning. My name is Melinda Haring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so happy to be back in our headquarters office in Washington. And I've been wanting to have this conversation for 16 or 17 months. I can't even remember. My dear friend Yevhen Hlibovytsky is joining me, and he has just flown in from Kyiv, Ukraine. Yevhen is a partner at Pro Mova consulting firm and the most insightful voice on civil society developments in Ukraine and the broader region. So today, he's agreed to tell us about 3 important new institutions that were formed after the Euromaidan. He's going to be speaking about public broadcaster Suspline, about Naftogaz, and then also the Ukraine Cultural Fund. Welcome, Yevhen. Here's how we're going to spend our time. We have a presentation from Yevhen. I'm going to ask him some questions, and then we would love to have your questions. And you can start typing those in the Zoom chat, and they'll be sent to me. And I'll definitely acknowledge you. Thank you for joining us. Yevhen, the floor is yours. Welcome to Washington. Welcome to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much. Probably the hat that I'm wearing this time is a member of the supervisory board of the public service broadcast. This is the collective body. And in this case, I'm representing myself and voicing my opinions. Nonetheless, I would like to draw some historical parallels and put in the context what's happening in Ukraine right now. So it's more easy, or so it's easier to grasp for those who are following Ukraine. And as we know from a famous quote from Brian Mefford, Ukraine is never as good or as bad as it seems. So here we go. Okay.
Is it not responding? Oh, there we go. It's coming.
Yep. All right. Ukraine has gone through 3 revolutions in the last 30 years, and this is the first one. This is the student hunger strike on Maidan. University students went on hunger strike on Maidan in 1990. Their goal was basically to try and shift the policies of the communist government that would eventually open the window of opportunity for Ukraine to become independent. And I'm not sure I have control of the presentation.
Next slide, please. There you are.
Yeah. Yeah. The students in 1990, very often when we simplify the history, what they achieved, usually it's people say that they were basically at the forefront of the independence movement. Probably they created this window of opportunity, and it's important to understand that the change in Ukraine over the last 30 years is so tremendous that we actually have to put it in the context to appreciate the magnitude. Then the second time people were on the streets in Kyiv was during the Orange Revolution, 2004. And that was the time when people went on to defend their voting preference. But if we look at the protest of 1990, then the university students actually appealed to the government. They were saying, the government, please accept better policy. In 2004, they did not appeal to the government, but they actually wanted someone good to lead the government. Well, the next revolution in 2014, when Euromaidan happened, was the moment when Ukrainians realized, I would say the critical mass of Ukrainians realized that if you do not control the government, if you do not put the system of checks and balances around the government, then any government can go wild and can actually start persecuting those who are innocent and harming people. So if we look how the thinking of the government was progressing, it brought us to 2014 when Ukrainians arrived to the position that a whole set of new institutions have to be created, or some old institutions have to be put under public control, not only the cabinet control, not only the political control. Political control is not enough. And let me show how this worked. 1990, 1991, this is Ukraine's attempt to leave the USSR, and Ukraine narrowly escapes renewal of the USSR. 2004 was about personality more than about the system. 2014 was all about the system. And then up until 2021, we have these new institutions that are arising. I would like to focus on three institutions, but these three institutions are actually telling us a story, and there are many more institutions behind those. I could probably bring a dozen to prove the points that I'm making. The first one is Naftogaz. Naftogaz is the institution that is over 20 years old. It's a state-owned enterprise that was created basically to procure gas and oil and to sell it. And this was the institution that up until 2014 was basically used by political elites to steal money in huge numbers. And the story of Naftogaz is the story of a ill-run institution that actually created tremendous risks for the country, and geopolitical risks as well as security risks, as well as simply, current account risks. In 7 years, when Naftogaz was run by an independent board, Ukraine became fully independent of Russian gas, and this was first of all because of the Naftogaz management. Billions in annual losses turned into billions in revenues for the budget, and Naftogaz became the prime company that was sending money into the budget. Gazprom was defeated in court, something that a lot of people were saying that is not possible to do. Gazprom is too strong. It was defeated in Stockholm in court and ordered to compensate Ukraine for its overpayments. And finally, the retail market was launched as a flat owner, for instance, or as a house owner. You can now switch between different providers and see which option works best for you. The second case is the case of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. It took several years after the Euromaidan for Ukrainian Cultural Foundation to arrive. It was founded in 2017 as a state foundation, which funds cultural projects across Ukraine through grants. It issues grants. It usually has several hundred million hryvnias, which is roughly about 30 to 40 million US dollars, and it gives out these money, that money in grants every year. And the funding model is very different from what Ukrainians usually had. You have independent experts who are deciding which projects have merit. And then based on that merit, they say, okay, these projects have to be supported. And then the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation just simply manages the resources. But the management of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation seldom makes any content-based decisions, or unless the project is very big or there are some special provisions, in which case, for instance, the supervisory board would have to step in. Thousands of applications were received every year. It became a blast because once there was a chance for cultural leaders, for those who had some ideas, those who wanted to do something, an opportunity to have a grant without any preconditions or without becoming part of something. So you could just simply apply and see if your idea beats the other idea and if you win. And out of several thousand applications every year, usually over 1,000 applications would win. And these people would be funded, and then they would not only become people who would implement their projects, but they would also gain experience that would allow them later on to be better with fundraising. Mm-hmm. So this was also bringing up a whole set of new actors, new young players all across Ukraine. A lot of support went not to Kyiv, not to big cities, but actually to small towns and villages even. So this was quite an effort that showed how decentralized the entire cultural life is. And then other sectors started saying, okay, well, Ukrainian Cultural Foundation works so well that we would like to have something like this in education or in media or in other sectors, all until this year. And then the third institution is the public service broadcast, Suspline. It's the big institution which has been transformed from state radio and state television. And what happened, this was one of the first laws that was passed right after the Euromaidan was over in April 2014. The cabinet of ministers no longer controlled the television and radio, the state television and radio, which turned into a public one. But instead, there was an independent supervisory board instituted, and that independent supervisory board was consists of two parts. One part is representatives of the fractions of the parliament. The other part are the civil society people who are elected on their own electoral process inside the civil society. There is provision that there is always one more person from the NGOs than from the political sector. What happened was news and information programming has become independent and balanced. The news programming is probably the most balanced and the most unbiased on Suspline, if you compare that to other players on the market. Minority programming, youth programming, other sectors have moved to a modern set of standards allowing greater inclusion. So we're not only servicing the popular, we're also servicing those who have special needs, those who do not necessarily are not necessarily present in mainstream. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is that the company is now more efficiently run. It has anti-corruption policies implemented. It has its debts paid, and there were a lot of outstanding debts from previous periods. And number of employees has been optimized. It's not any longer a resemblance of big Soviet factory where you have thousands and thousands of people, and some of these people are actually doing conflicting tasks, and so it's no longer the case. It's now an efficiently run company. Well, now the problem is that Naftogaz was decapitated this spring, and the cabinet of ministers has relieved the supervisory board for 2 days, changed the CEO, and put the supervisory board back, which was a shock to the entire system of independent management. Then the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation was well run until the supervisory board rotation produced some very questionable appointments from the president, from the Ministry of Culture, as well as from some of the NGOs that were selected in quite untransparent way. As a result, we got people in the supervisory board, in the new supervisory board of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, who are simply unfit to serve on the board and who cannot judge professionally. As a result, the supervisory board has failed to appoint the new director. Then the stronger candidates have left, And then eventually they have appointed the director, which for long period of time could not start the activities. And what we have is basically the ruins of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. The institution as such is now under huge challenge. It's not known whether the mission stands. It's not known whether it's going to support the projects that it did support. The new management has vividly said that it has other priorities, like, for instance, big projects or supporting the 30 years of Ukraine's independence, which is a big government inspired idea to have huge celebration of 30 years of independence. This is something that is away from the mission of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. The third institution is the public service broadcast that has been warned that it has low television ratings. And because it has low television ratings, the high representatives of the Office of the President assume that this means that there can be public trust to public service broadcast, which is ridiculous. First of all, the ratings and the viewership is growing, and it's been growing. Second of all, the government has been using funding as a leverage, basically unfunding or defunding the public service broadcast in order to decrease its capacity, and it's been happening for years. This year was the only case when the funding was provided mostly in full, and in my suspicion, this was the only reason for this was because this is the election year, and the hope was that the government could have its own representative winning the position of the CEO. Public service broadcast has a steep growth curve on internet. It has huge following on the internet, and it has huge following on the radio as well. So it's not only about television or one television channel as they're talking, but the most serious question is: are we talking about attack on independent institutions? Are we talking about the government actually putting down the independent institutions? And what we see right now is that the new institutions face tremendous risks. Probably this has been the worst year since 2014 for the new independent institutions. They have been under systemic pressure. Sometimes that pressure borders with assault. Attacks on these institutions have not diminished in recent weeks, regardless of the signals from both domestic and international players. That pretty much says that the government is willing to go in defiance of what both the public inside Ukraine and the international partners are saying. But at the same time, the government is not self-sustainable. The government needs money to borrow, the government needs assistance in security, the government needs public support, but at the same time is behaving like it doesn't need them. And finally, with Zelensky evaluating, in my opinion, pretty good chances to be re-elected, that pretty much paves the ground for a prolonged standoff between the civil society and the government in Ukraine. And usually what we can say is that the standoff itself is a detour from development path. It has huge transactional costs. And it's not productive, first of all, for the government. There hasn't been a government in the history of Ukraine that withstood the public pressure. There is no reason why this one has to withstand, should it decide to go into confrontation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think you've really done us a big service, because most of us here in Washington have not been following the drama with Suspline or with the Cultural Fund. So thank you for that overview. I think the first question is an obvious one. You've outlined attacks on three important institutions. Which one was first? Walk us through the timeline again. And was it a concerted attack, or is it sort of, are they shrugging and saying, let it happen? What's the attitude if you were to assess it?
Well, I would say that of course the first case was Naftogaz.
Naftogaz first.
And it came as a shock.
Okay.
It came as a shock. I wouldn't say that the conditions were over comfortable for everyone else, but by the time when Naftogaz happened, the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation was already in crisis.
Okay.
But Naftogaz showed the extent to which the government is willing to go to have its own way. And I would say this is not a productive approach.
So when you talk to Naftogaz people, they'll say the process wasn't transparent from the beginning. The original process of selection wasn't transparent. If you tell Naftogaz you're not playing by the rules, you're breaking corporate governance, they'll say, well, the original process when CEO Kovalyev was selected wasn't done correctly either. What's your response to that?
Well, you have to draw a line somewhere, right? And the fact that you had a lot of Ukrainian institutions have the original sin. If you use this to justify the further mishandlings, that's not going to bring us anywhere. It's a huge step away from good governance. If we eventually want to apply OECD rules, if we eventually want to join the civilized world, that means we have to play by the rules. And if you're not playing by the rules, then because someone hasn't played by the rules, I don't know, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever, that's going to be difficult. I would say that there are procedural problems with many institutions when they were started, especially those that were started right after Maidan. There was a lot of political decision-making that had to be done at that point. There was a huge vacuum of power. Are we trying to justify someone's bad behavior, or are we trying to have sound institutions? What's the goal here? And I think in this case, it's clear that the institutions are suffering, and as a result, the missions that they are created to fulfill are suffering as well. And then society without those missions will not be able to function efficiently. What happens is this attack on institutions basically diminishes the political space. It shrinks the political space. As a result, it forces people to become more politically radical. It forces people who are on governing positions to consider becoming politically active against the government because they have to protect their legacy.
You mean the people who are in charge of these institutions?
For instance, because they have to protect their legacy. They have to protect their missions in many cases, especially when we're talking about people who were starting the institutions or who joined the institutions right after Maidan. There was a lot of self-sacrifice on behalf of these people. Many people have refused the good positions, comfortable positions with a lot of perks just to serve. Now, when they're sidelined, they feel betrayed,
sure.
And not because of how they are treated, but because how the missions that they were supporting were treated.
Yevhen, I think in the West here in Washington, we were very, very concerned about what happened with Naftogaz, and the U.S. government made a lot of noise about it, both publicly and privately. And I don't think we've made much noise about Suspline or the Cultural Fund. Within Ukraine, do these issues have any resonance? Do most people care about them? Do they know about them? What's the mood like in the country?
Well, with Naftogaz, it's quite a divisive issue because a lot of people still believe that Naftogaz is not fully free of its old reputation of the siphoning institution. But when we're talking about Suspline or Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, Dovzhenko Center, or other institutions, this is not the case. And I would say this, I'm sorry that a lot of people in Ukraine respect the legacy of the stereotypes more than they respect the fact that the institutions were renewed. But when we're talking about the cultural institutions, this is a really serious issue because What they are, the transformation that they are responsible for is the homework that Ukraine has to do on its own. It's the inner transformation of the society. It's the inner transformation of the individual. If these institutions don't function, Ukraine is going to stay as Soviet as it is for a longer period of time, and transformation will be slower and more painful and will cost more. So in a sense, I would say that the cultural institutions are not less important than the institutions that provide something more tangible, like, for instance, energy or other commodities.
Good point. That's an excellent point. Tell me more about the Ukrainian Cultural Fund. You said that they were doing very well. That was your assessment for 3 years. 3 or 4 years, and now things have changed, and it looks like a lot of resources are going to be directed towards this big splashy government celebration later this year.
If they risk to do so, because there's been a public outcry against this, but the risk is that there is no confidence. The risk with the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation is there is no confidence that it will stay as open and inclusive as it was. And it allowed supporting the projects that are away from the discretion of the chinovnik, of the Soviet styles civil servant.
Okay.
When we had when the Ministry of Culture used to be giving out money before, it would actually support the project that it deemed important, that it thought were important. Now, with arrival of independent experts that are judging, you have many more options of different kinds of projects being supported, and as a result, the diversity may be at risk. The quality of or the saturation of cultural life may be at risk, or and then in the end the local leadership may be at risk, because these are the people who are offering something, that are trying to do something, and if they don't get the resources, then what we're doing is we're basically punishing the initiative right at the beginning.
Well, and the point too is to develop people at the local level, right?
Exactly.
And you're going to cut the legs out from that if they pursue the model that you've articulated.
And then with Suspline, nothing has happened yet, but it's important that nothing terrible happens with Suspline. Exactly, because Suspline is the next big institution in line. It's the institution that already has been publicly criticized from the office of the president.
What did they say specifically?
They said specifically that the ratings are low. Okay. That in their opinion, Suspline is not as unbiased as it says.
Did they have any evidence for that claim?
Well, they didn't bring any evidence, but Suspline has evidence that this is not the case. Okay. Suspline is being independently monitored for this, and one of the KPIs that editors have was to be a very balanced, very unbiased. So in that sense, Suspline is probably offering the best quality of news programming and information programming. And do the positions of different political parties, are they voiced in the air? Yes, of course, they should be. Mm-hmm. You know, you have political discussion in the country, you should have representatives of these different voices voicing that. So I think there are two reasons why this is happening. One reason is because there is certain consensus among the big private players in media that allows the basically allows oligopolic control of the agenda in the country. And Suspline is growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and it starts threatening this oligopoly.
What's the market share for TV? I know you said TV, internet, and radio, well, but let's talk about TV first.
For TV, the market share is about 1%. But the problem is not quantitative, it's qualitative. That 1% now, first of all, it's growing. And second of all, that 1% is the 1% that actually makes many more decisions than its share, and it's quite influential.
So it's the quality of the eyeballs.
It's the quality of the eyeballs.
Okay.
Yeah. The second thing is that if we go to the internet, that's way more than 1%.
Okay. Do you have a number?
It's difficult to estimate the number, but I would say that, for instance, if you look at Facebook penetration, Facebook is the biggest social network in Ukraine.
Sure.
Public service broadcast is second biggest player out of all media in Ukraine.
Wow. Online, on Facebook.
Online, on Facebook.
Okay.
It's also huge. It's also huge in its ability to cover local affairs. It's also big on other social networks. Its own site is growing twofold to fourfold every year.
Okay.
So Suspline is picking up steam and is actually showing better and better results every year. And I think this is the real concern. The concern is that you're going to have a loose cannon in otherwise organized field.
Step back for a minute and remind us, how big of a deal is this? All top 10 stations in Ukraine are owned by oligarchs? Is that figure still right?
I would say even beyond that. Basically, there are 5 or 6 major holdings that control almost all television stations and big radio stations. And
a majority of Ukrainians still get their news from TV. Is it about 80% or 85%?
And most Ukrainians who get their news from TV that actually have political interest, vested political interest. And then the problem with the private media is that the private media are not trying to make money of their existence. They're all in losses.
Okay.
They've been in losses since 2008.
Because this is a really important point. I didn't know this until about 2 months ago. Ukrainian television is super expensive. Ukrainian television is much more expensive than it is here in the States. And part of it is because Ukrainians and Russians also have very expensive equipment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's 3 cameras and they're moving, and the quality, the production quality is much higher in Kyiv than it is here.
And that is basically to keep the audience awake, keep it fascinated at every point, and being able to through this to control the agenda. You see, this is the way how big political players get their influence on the parliament, get their influence in the parliament, in the cabinet, in the walls of other state institutions, and then eventually they are able to transform it into resources, into money, through the means of political corruption. So in a sense, media in Ukraine seldom are part of the advertisement and subscription cycle.
Yep.
Their big media are part of the political corruption cycle.
Yep.
And then you have Suspline, which is kind of icebreaker that grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And then from the viewpoint of the political players that prefer the old ways, it's like cancer, you know. So it has to be dealt with as soon as possible before it grows too big.
Gotcha.
So basically, what we see the whole wave of tendencies to push the independent broadcasting, independent institutions, independent governance away from their ability to operate efficiently.
And of Suspline's budget, is it all funded by the Ukrainian government, or does it take aid from the U.S. government, from the Brits, from the Canadians?
It takes, it is mostly funded by the Ukrainian government.
Okay.
And that's part of the problem, that every year the government basically has leverage over the budget. You know, if you behave, you will get more. If you don't behave, well, we'll see. And that's how it's been under Poroshenko. And now I'm afraid that this game is the game that's going to resume. But there are other ways of more kind of automatic remuneration that would allow, for instance, if you connect yourself to certain levies or certain taxes, then it becomes easier, as the experience of some European countries show, like for instance Lithuania or some other countries that have also recently stepped into this game. So we'll have to see about that. The amendments to the law are already in the parliament. We'll see how the parliament will react to it. The important point is that should Suspline be threatened, we're not only threatening the particular broadcaster, we're threatening the entire market. Suspline is probably one of the biggest professional schools for the rest of the media. People usually start up at the public service broadcast, then they move to other private or other media or international media. It's got very good penetration into the local communities that other media do not have. It's in many cases the only accessible media for many people, especially in rural areas. So there are other issues at stake, and I'm afraid that we simply cannot risk it. And looking forward to the future potential visit of the Ukrainian president to the White House, I'm very hopeful that the result will be that the independent institutions will be intact and will continue to exist the way they should.
You can count on us. We'll bring these issues up. Don't worry about it. You're a father, and you're not supposed to love one child more than the other. So but you're also a member of the supervisory board. Do you have a particular show on Suspline that is first rate? You say that this show is influencing some of the other broadcasters, or is there? I know that you probably don't want to give high credit to one show over another, but is there one that is so good that is on other oligarchic televisions, or they take shows from time to time? Does that happen?
No, this is all. I would say this horizontal cooperation is only it only starts to form.
Okay.
We don't fully understand how it will form, but what you accented is very important. One of the types of programming that Ukrainian parents, for instance, feel that we're not getting is the programming for the kids, the programming for the teenagers. As a result, most of the programming that they consume is usually the Russian-produced programming that comes via YouTube or other social networks. And this is exactly the unique place where a public service broadcaster has opportunity to make the difference, and the work is underway. We have to understand that within the last 4 years there was tremendous work that was done, and a lot of things are in the pipeline as we speak, including the programming for the youth, including the programming for the kids. And we understand how important it is that they all share the same narrative then in school, as they grow up, and eventually they become the citizens of the same country regardless where they grew up.
Let me ask you one more question, then I want to bring our audience in. Are there other institutions? You've highlighted Naftogaz, Suspline, and the Ukrainian Culture Fund. Are there other institutions that you're worried about that we should be watching sort of as a barometer for an attack on institutions?
I think we should be watching any institutions that have public funding and that have independent supervisory boards, regardless whether they are for-profit or non-profit. Ukrhydroenergo is another institution that has been voicing problems. The whole set of cultural institutions, the Mistetsky Arsenal, which is a big, probably one of the key cultural institutions in Ukraine, has just had its own election of the CEO for the next term, and it has been canceled because of so many critical procedural mistakes that were allowed by the government institution that runs the process. Then the question is, why are they allowing these mistakes? Why they are not reading the law attentively? Why they are not doing their work professionally? And every time when you have this kind of limbo situation, there are suspicions, and it's killing trust. Then there are institutions that have had successful elections, like for instance Dovzhenko Center.
Tell us more about that. I'm not familiar with that.
The Dovzhenko Center is an important institution because it basically is an institution that has the entire cinematographic memory of Ukraine. It basically is the institution that is responsible for preserving the heritage that we have. They have had a very bright leader, Ivan Kozlenko, who eventually was ousted. A new person was elected, who resumed the same mission, and the Ministry of Culture simply refused to appoint, to formalize, to legalize the procedure, even though everything was done in accordance with the letter of the law. So the whole message that it sends to the civil society is that the law will be applied selectively. Whenever the civil society will be challenging, the agendas, or will be challenging the approaches taken by the government, it will be shut down. And this is not the type of approach that civil society will take. Especially that, for instance, with Mistetsky Arsenal, the person who almost got elected, he lacked one vote, was the former Minister of Culture under Yanukovych.
Oh my God!
Who's been quite rude in his expressions during the process. Who's been actually very actively voicing his anti-civil society stand. And so we see in many cases that the old guard is using this situation to make a comeback, or is offering its services to basically come in, scare everyone, and then someone who will eventually be elected, different than that person from old guard, will not look that bad.
Do you think part of the I'm going to bring the audience in just a minute, but I have one last question for you. I'm not shy. This is the provocative question. Are you ready for it? Is part of the problem because Zelensky's government doesn't have a lot of familiarity with civil society, and they don't realize how powerful it is? We're 7 years out from the Euromaidan revolution. When you look at his government, it's a government that's very, very different from Poroshenko's government or from his first government, where there are a lot of people who came from civil society or were plugged in and had strong relationships. Is that part of the problem, do you think?
I think part of the problem, in my opinion, the biggest part of the problem is that there's no understanding how the whole system works.
Interesting.
And
Still.
And there is this willingness for shortcuts and for easy fixes and manual control. I think, to me, the Ukrainian government resembles a case of instant gratification. It has to be done and now, and if it doesn't work that way, then the institution doesn't look that good in the eyes of the administration. So it's not necessarily pro-Russian sentiment, or it's not necessarily, evil-minded attempt to, with kind of malice intention, to conquer the world or whatever. It's in many cases, it's lack of understanding. There's also another thing that probably hurts the cultural foundations, is that a lot of people that are familiar with Zelensky, and a lot of people that came with Zelensky into the government, came from showbiz.
Correct.
Showbiz has been hit hard by COVID. And many companies that do not feel themselves financially well are looking for new sources of revenue. And in this, in their eyes, these cultural activists or these independent media get way too much money than they should, while, for instance, the big concert halls or festivals, that used to have commercial success in previous years, last year didn't get their profits, and they suffered. So I think there are two kinds of pressure that coincided: a political short-sightedness and lack of professionalism on one side, and also this case of COVID that affected the showbiz industry.
Yeah, I think your analysis is right on point. And as social scientists, the first point makes me very nervous that this administration has such short time horizons. I mean, we know that in order to attract investment, in order to develop, those time horizons have to be lengthened. So that's something to watch as well. Audience, it's your turn. Please go ahead and type some questions into Zoom. I have a wonderful question from Robert Brinkley in London. Hello, Robert. Great to have you with us. He says, Yevhen, good to see you. The common thread here seems to be reluctance by the Ukrainian administration government to accept genuinely independent institutions. Do you agree that current events in South Africa and Haiti provide worrying examples of where such government attitudes of reluctance to give up control and accept accountability can lead?
I would hope that we would not have to face whatever we see in South Africa and Haiti. Ukraine has got enough suffering in Crimea and Donbass, but you know, it's there is a limit to how many irresponsible decisions the government can take. And if the government will take one too much, the system will break, and that's dangerous. And we've seen the system breaking in Ukraine already, and every time it looks ugly.
For sure. Tom Wilson wants to know, would you see trade unions as part of civil society, and what role do they play today?
Well, it very much depends, because we have had with the trade unions probably a more sophisticated story. The trade unions I would say that the trade unions were caught in their post-Soviet legacy. So in many senses, they were not as efficient as they could be. They were not transforming to a win-win between the labor and the owner. But in many cases would see rather the situation as zero-sum game, and that prevented the trade unions from becoming effective partners of other civil society organizations. But that very much depends on industry, that very much depends on where you are, you know, on who you are. We just got a letter from the head of one of the 3 trade unions that we have inside the public service broadcast, thanking the management for ability to conduct dialogue, you know, and that's something that you don't often observe, you know. And when there's willingness to listen on both ends, it can work, but you don't always have that.
Great, thank you. Another question for you. This one's a slightly different one from Alan Meerbaum. He says, foreign investment in Ukraine remains a risk. It's actually negative now. Yet there are investment opportunities in manufacturing, aerospace, and other capabilities. What are the top priorities for change within Ukraine to attract those investors? If you were giving advice to the government of Ukraine, what would you say?
Rule of law. Rule of law is number one. You have to establish rule of law, because you have to establish conditions for the investor that the investor will feel predictable. And what I'm talking about here is a huge problem with unpredictability of the situation. You know, we're all under, as a member of the supervisory board, I'm under constant stress of uncertainty.
What do you mean?
Because I don't understand what the next government move is going to be. I don't understand how the law that have always been applied in certain way will be applied in different way now. You know, as we've seen from the printouts, readouts of the conversations between Presidents Zelensky and Trump, Zelensky wanted to have his 100% his own general prosecutor. Well, now he has. And general prosecutor office is not the office that serves the law. We just had a number of very strange criminal investigations open against Suspline or against people at Suspline. that is part of the, I'm not even talking, I didn't put it into my presentation because it's so regular, it's part of the game, you understand that this, you're doing something, then probably someone will criminally investigate you, So this, of course, it doesn't create good conditions for investment. So as a result, most of the new investment comes from investors who are already on the market, who already have vested interest. But that doesn't help the economy, that doesn't help the overall growth potential. I think Ukraine is a very potent country. I think Ukraine is a country that has enormous opportunities. It needs more security, it needs better rule of law. And, once it has this, and needs competent government, once it has these three conditions, I think, it can start developing it at a high pace.
Absolutely. Our good friend at Harvard, Emily Chenell Justice, wants to know, can you comment on the current efforts towards judicial reform and Zelensky's recent veto of the bill that included foreign experts in oversight?
I am not fully professional to comment this, so I would like to
you can take a pass.
To skip this question.
You can totally take a pass. Yeah. That's fine. Okay. Alexander Epin wants to know, Emily, we will get you an answer to that question. We'll call some people who follow judicial reform closely.
I mean, I know about it only in general terms, so I don't want to.
No, but I respect you for that. He's not a specialist on judicial reform. He's a broader specialist on civil society and social change in Ukraine. Alexander Epin wants to know, what can the U.S. and its allies do to support Ukrainian civil society in maintaining their hold on these independent institutions?
Well, I would say that there are two responses. The operational response, the tactical response, is to keep this issue on the agenda. And frankly, I was expecting that there would be a more active position on behalf of the United States with regard to independent institutions. At least it wasn't as sound as I thought it would be. Maybe there were a lot of things behind the scenes that I don't see, but this is something that would be important.
Frankly, I think a lot of the information you gave today is new. The embassy may know it, but on Suspline and on the Cultural Fund, this is all new for us.
And you see, with Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, for instance, there was a meeting with G7 embassies, and the information is circulating. The question is whether it's interpreted in the national capitals, including the Washington, government offices, as important. Then the other thing I would say is a strategic thing. And I think that we're undermining, and this kind of surprises me. I hear a lot of discussion about China in the United States over the last years. But I don't see why Ukraine is not viewed as part of this U.S.-China relations issue.
What does Ukraine have to do with China?
Ukraine is a key country to make sure that Russia doesn't become doesn't fall as junior partner for China, because then we're going to have a completely different game in the Eurasian continent. In that sense, it's important that Ukrainian institutions survive, and it's important that Ukrainian institutions provide an example for the governments across the former Soviet Union, so they don't fall prey to Chinese interest. And in that sense, I think if you're talking about protecting democracy, free market economy, free unrestricted trade, we should be absolutely committed to make sure that Ukraine is a success case now, because it's much cheaper to help Ukraine to stand firmly on its feet right now than to solve another cycle of problems with Russia later. So in that sense, we're right now talking about very small steps that have to be made, and that unfortunately are not being made, as we've seen with regards to NATO, with regards to Nord Stream 2, with regards to other things. I think this is part of this cold shower or cold hot shower at the same time. Ukraine is offering some bad news, but Ukraine generally has to be supported, because Ukraine is not all bad news. That's the point. We are now in the middle of this transformation. We have to make this transformation a success, and this is where our efforts have to be focused on.
Okay, so give us some good news, because your presentation today was mostly bad news.
Well, whatever I was talking about last time here, when I was talking about these wonderful projects across Ukraine,
just remind us, people may not have been able to listen.
In Ivano-Frankivsk, for instance, Teple Misto and Promprilad, the Ukrainian Catholic University, their new university startups that are going across the country.
These are all independent.
These are all independent. Yes. There's a lot of there are a lot of interesting enterprises, both in social sphere, in economics, in city development. The decentralization reform is really bringing a lot of fresh air into the both political process and local development process. Ukraine is full of good news as well as full of risks. And because it's very often difficult to see the good things beyond the risks, they kind of get under-communicated.
Wonderful. Andrew has a question about Mozhenko, the Ukrainian State Cinematic Fund. The Atlantic Council held an event on Ukrainian film in civil society this past winter. What more can you say about Ukraine's state film institutions and their role in civil society? Are they still growing, and have any issues emerged recently?
Well, beyond what I've said earlier, I would say that they are just they're facing the same challenges as all other cultural institutions.
Okay.
And I think cultural institutions are under a specific threat because, as I said, they're not facing only the political issues, they're also facing the COVID-related issues.
Yeah. One last question for you. So as the United States and as Kyiv prepares for a meeting between our presidents, what advice would you have for Washington policymakers? Some people in Kyiv think that the United States was excessively critical and that we focused too much on anti-corruption, and that the Biden administration has been too loud and outspoken about that, and maybe not as warm and as supportive and outspoken on the war. What do you think that we should do both, or that we should continue to hit hard on the anti-corruption piece?
I think there's one thing that is often underestimated is Ukraine is full of new agency that arose after Maidan, after 2014. And in my optics, Ukraine has been independent since 2014. Ukrainian independence has been conceived in 1991, but it has become an independent country in 2014. And what we have right now in Donbass and Crimea is our independence war, in fact. But I think if we let the local actors support the local actors by providing them a hope of sustainable security, which is NATO. If we make sure that there are red lines and these red lines are followed with regard to quality of state governance, if we make sure that Ukraine moves towards rule of law, and Ukraine does make small steps one at a time in that direction. They're just not consistent. They're not systematic. They're not, in some cases, they were badly thought through. If we don't make cause and effect mistake, which in my opinion was with a lot of anti-corruption activity, which was an effect, not the cause of many problems. And in itself, it's going to be much easier to deal with corruption once the country becomes more safe. There will be less zero-sum game thinking on behalf of any actor. So I would put it this way: Ukraine would have to be conceptualized in the eyes of the US administration, any US administration. And that would probably last as long as the fault lines, the values fault lines, lay inside Ukraine or next to Ukraine. The moment these fault lines, this Berlin Wall that fell in 1989, it was in Berlin 32 years ago. Then it moved to the Soviet border, then it moved inside Ukraine. Now it's on the separation line between Ukraine and the occupied territories. Eventually, this wave of transformation will move inside Russia. We have to be ready for that, because that's going to be a huge change. Ukrainian policies towards Russia will start resembling Polish policies towards Ukraine for a longer period of time. There's going to be a huge change, and I don't think there is enough strategic thinking about that. At least it's not reflected in the outcomes of the negotiations that we see. I can understand why the Ukrainian side may be short-sighted. I can't justify why the American side can be short-sighted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about. Thank you for joining us today. We encourage you to join us on Wednesday. We will be hosting former Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Please check our website for more information. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank my wonderful team, Shelby, Adrian, Doug, and Andrew. Until next time, thank you.